This is the 10th of July 2011, and I'm here today with Hymie Goldblatt, who's going to share his memories with Dad.
I want to tell you, Farrell, of my life's association with my little brother, who eventually, not eventually, but by the time he was about 25, he was already my big brother. We grew up, as you know, in a very, very small town of Reddersburg. My first memories of Hirsch was his Brit. I remember he was born in Bloemfontein. My mother came home with this baby, and the Brit was to be in Reddersburg. We had a man called Charlie. In those days, in South African parlance, it was known as the boy. The boy who did the floors, who looked after the garden, and there was a ritual on a Friday morning. All the silver was always polished for Shabbat. Whether we were at home or we were out somewhere else for Shabbat, the only other place we could have been was the other Jewish family, the Saxes anyway. But this was the ritual of Friday morning, and I used to sit with him, and he was telling me what was going to happen at this imminent Brit. He told me that a man came from, since I was born in Reddersburg, a man came from Bloemfontein, a little man with a beard, and they put my tokolossi on a box, and he had a big knife, and he just chopped out a piece of my tokolossi. So I was very intrigued to see what was going to happen to my new little brother. I was 5 years old at the time. And with quite a number of people there. I think it must have been on a Sunday, because otherwise there wouldn't have been so many people from Bloemfontein. And everybody was coming to wish me Mazel Tov, Mazel Tov. What was all the Mazel Tov about? And for some reason, I did not have a Pidjana Ben when I was born, and it was only performed when Hirsch was born. And they tried to explain me what happened, what the excitement was all about, and it was that I had belonged to Mr. Itzikal Kaplan from Bloemfontein, who was a Cohen, and my father on this occasion had brought me back. And I became quite hysterical. I can remember that plainly. There was a big couch in the lounge, and I was kicking and carrying on. I don't want to be, and why was I Mr. Kaplan's little boy? And only now I'm becoming my father's boy. Anyway, that was over. Then we grew up. He was always, as a very little boy, was interested in motor cars, always motor cars. We lived in a house which was on the main national road to Cape Town and the coast, and he knew every car that passed from a very, very young age. He knew which was a Buick and a Chrysler and a Ford and so on. He intrigued, and he had his little motor cars, always playing with his little motor cars. As he grew up, he was very busy with model planes and things like that. And since both of us went to boarding school at the age of 10, it so happened that in my last year of school in 1940 was his first year in Standard 4. There were 3 hostels, which at the Great College was a big school, and we were not in the same hostel, but we met every day in the communal dining room, and we had a very close association. And there weren't many little boys of his age in the boarding school, and as a result of that, wherever we went on a Saturday or a Sunday, we went together. Marjorie was then later on, she was then already at boarding school, at Unisi School on a Sunday afternoon. The two of us used to walk. It was quite a long way. We used to walk to go and visit her. I didn't know at that time that he was having difficulties with, he was with school work and so on. And I was having my own difficulties at the time, but somehow I managed to finish matric. And then after that first year that we were together, our paths changed.
Because when you were at school, when you were at school, how often would you come home to Redisburg, or how often did your parents visit? What was the sort of...
Our parents visited us quite often during
on a Sunday.
On a Sunday, and there were 4 school holidays during the year, and also because we didn't have a great deal of company in Redisburg during the holidays, we somehow were very close. Then after I left school, we went to after I left school, we sort of became separated, and I came back from the army in 1945, when by which time my parents had left Redisburg, and they were living in Langebaan, where they were running a hotel. And Hirsch was, I think, in Standard 8 or Standard 9 at Saks, where apparently he was having a lot of difficulty at school. In those days, nobody knew about dyslexia, of which both of us suffered, but he in a much more serious degree than I, and he wasn't terribly happy at school. But fortunately he could play rugby, and that sort of made up for him. He was a good rugby player. But a year later, must have been in 1947, my parents left Langebaan, and they came to live in Greenpoint, where they had a big house. And in those days, of course, when your parents lived in Cape Town, there was no question of you being a boarder at university or at some other place, and we went to live at home, both of us. It was a year or 2 later, I think I was in second year. We always went to, during the holidays, we spent a lot of time. My father had a shop in Fishhook, and he used to want us to come to the shop and somehow help in the shop. We could do things, we could deliver, when there was a truck, we could deliver stuff to various places and serve behind the counter a little bit. And during one holiday, I was with my father in the shop, and he had a heart attack. And then it seemed to be just obvious that Hirsch was going to leave school, and he was going to go into the shop. I don't really remember how it was, but there was a woman working in the shop who had been working there before my father took over, Mrs. Rogers, and Hirsch and I, in the holidays, we worked in the shop. I don't have any clear memories of that. I went back to university, and he carried on running the shop. My father was out of the business for at least 6 or 8 weeks, and Hirsch carried the burden. We then come to 1948, and I decided to go to Israel. I came back at the end of it was June that I went, early in June.
What made you decide to go to Israel?
I always knew. I was in Palestine on 2 occasions during my service in the desert.
In the Second World War.
Yes,
Right.
and when we came back from Italy, we also came back to Egypt, and then before we waited our turn to go home, I had another visit to Palestine. I felt very good in Palestine, because growing up in a little town in the Free State, there was a lot of anti-Semitism, and I always had a chip on my shoulder being Jewish. I didn't feel the anti-Semitism so much because I was away during the time when the Germans were winning the war, and I later heard from Margie and Joyce how that we'd put swastikas on the walls of the shop, and how would they would, for instance, fill up with putty or matches the Yale locks of the shop, so that it was very difficult for them to open the shop and so on.
And there wasn't that much anti-Semitism at Grey College, was there?
No, at Grey College we really didn't feel anti-Semitism. And it was obvious that if anyway, my parents were very upset about the whole business. I already had an association with Micky, and they said, what does Micky think about it? And I said, Micky thinks it's the right thing to do, and that sort of helped them. Then we came back, end of the year. My parents got into a state of panic when the university notified them that since we were on an ex-serviceman's loan arrangement and so on, that if we didn't come back before the next academic year, everything would be cancelled. And eventually I came back end of January, beginning of the end of December, the beginning of January. And Hirsch was very supportive of me. He knew that that I was having difficulty studying, and it was hard going. And he knew that I had this association with Micky, and he said to me, you know, and he was then already in a flourishing business. It was 1949. He was then already a businessman of standing, and he said to me, you know what, you've got a long way to go, and you want to get married. Come into business with me. And I said that he was very, very kind. And I said, listen, it won't work. It'll be a handicap to you. No, he said he didn't believe that. We would get on very well, and the business would grow and so on. But of course, I was very grateful for him, but I knew that I wouldn't go that way. And I just had to try and plod on and eventually become a doctor. Then, the next year, in 1950, we decided to get married. And my parents weren't very pleased with me, and Micky's parents obviously weren't very pleased. And I went up on June holiday.
Why weren't they pleased?
Because I was a student, and she was working.
No income yet.
Yes, and quite out of character. Micky's mother said, how are you going to live? So I said, well, we are getting money from the army for my studies and so on, and Micky's going to work. So she said, oh, that's very nice, isn't it? Anyway, but she said it in such a nice way that I really couldn't take offense. And we decided then to get married 6 months later. Hirsch, we got married. Hirsch looked after the shop. My parents went up by train to Windhoek with Margie and the rest of the family, Joyce and Annette. And Hirsch decided to doll up the shop a little bit, paint it and make it nice. He had a very hard time with my father. My father was an old type of businessman, and he had to pay his way all the time. And he came back and he said, what have you done? What are you wasting money for making that? And he really did a fine job. He worked at night and he painted the shelves and the shop and everything. But he was such a kind fellow. He always, if anything went wrong, he would say it was his fault. If something went right, he would say to my dad, you see, it was your suggestion that things went right. Eventually, he just couldn't take it anymore, and he started his salt business. I don't know what year it was that he got married, but I'm not really quite sure. By which time he was in the salt business. My father had sold the shop, but he always worried that my father should have some place to go to in the morning when he got up, and he would always find something for him to do, so that my father, felt that he was doing something, to watch, to see that they don't. My father had a thing about people stealing from him. Even the shop in Reddersburg, we as the children could go to the till, but none of the people who worked for him would go to the till. I think that was, I don't know if it was if it was like that all over the. It was, for me, it was embarrassing, because people worked for him. They were very, very loyal, and I can't believe that they would have ever stolen. But this was the system. So Hirsch used to watch. The business was growing, and there were empty bags to be looked after. God forbid somebody would steal the empty bags. My dad would keep tabs on that. As the business progressed, he always had a place for my dad. My dad had an office where he sat and he used to come and so that he should feel that he's a bala boss. Oh yes, then when we got married, my parents had a little Standard 7 and a truck for the shop, and he insisted that my father give us the Standard, so that we'd have a car at university. We had a place near the College of Music where we lived in the married quarters, which was very, very nice. And we had this car which made life very, very, very good for us. All Hirsch is doing, that was. Eventually, a year and a half later, Micky and I going to tell my parents that she's pregnant. Now, it was a thing in our I think it was all Jewish people, that the eldest daughter should get married before the son. You see, and then having got married, and we're coming very excited to tell them that we're pregnant, that Micky's pregnant, and my sister was just walked out, and Hirsch, the only first time in his life that he said, so why are you telling everybody? Why don't you put it in the newspaper? And Micky was very upset about that, because they thought it was quite unnecessary. You didn't have to come and advertise the fact that you're going to have a baby before it's shown, or somebody. Anyway, then they were still living out of the shop. That time they were still living out of the shop, and they used to bring us groceries from the shop, and used to come. And I remember my father coming to visit us in Protem, in the two little rooms which were not interleading. There was go onto the stoop, and he used to get into this. He can't stand it here. He's getting benout. He can't breathe here. He would have to go outside. Then I had quite a hard time at university. I failed my final year. We had the child. I thought it was the greatest tragedy that ever happened. And Hirsch stood by me. He said, never mind, we'll make a plan. Everything will be okay. And 6 months later, I qualified eventually. And then I started to realize that I had difficulty in studying, and that was the first time I realized that Hirsch had a lot more difficulty than I had. But he overcame this problem that he had. We used to share a room outside the house in Eaton. Eventually, when we moved to Eaton Road, we used to share a room. And he used to go out and leave me studying and so on. And he thought, really, I'm crazy. He used to see me get up early and so on. And so he was always supportive of me. Anyway, at the end of that, in June of 1953, it must have been, I qualified, and Micky went home, and I went in the standard car And yes, the standard car wanted to sell it, but I could only get £40 for the car. So no, I'm not going to sell it. So Hirsch bought me four retreaded tires, so that I could travel to Port Elizabeth. We put all our possessions in the standard car.
So what, you were actually leaving Cape Town?
And leaving Cape Town for Port Elizabeth.
Why were you going to Port Elizabeth?
Well, that was where I chose to do housemanship.
Oh, I see. You got a job there.
Yeah, I got a job there.
Oh, I see.
And not only, and then we had, not only did I have my world's possessions in the standard car, but Auntie Rachel got a lift with me. Auntie Rachel Bowman got a lift with me to Port Elizabeth. Her son Bertie would come and meet her in Port Elizabeth.